So, Tanshi, hello, bonjour. My name's David Garneau, and I'm curator of Kahwatsiretátie. And welcome to the panel called Contemporary Indigenous Art, Weaving Wisdom, Resilience, and Resistance. I'm here with Faye Mullen and Rudi Aker. And I'm going to begin by giving a little bit of an overview. I should say that I'm not on territory where the exhibitions are taking place, though where are they taking place? They're in cyberspace, but mostly they'll be in Montreal. I'm here at Oscana, Pile of Bones, Regina, which is in Saskatchewan, which is Treaty 4, which is the traditional territory of the Cree, the Saulteaux, the Nakota, Lakota, Dakota, and also of my people, the Métis. And I was invited kind of late in the game. I think we were in September or October of last year to curate this exhibition, which is on 4 main sites in Montreal. If we were to have a physical location, it would be at the Stuart Hall Art Gallery, at Art Mur, at Le Guild Gallery, and Pierre-François Houlet's Art Contemporain. Because of COVID, we're now in cyberspace, but if there's a chance, some of the galleries will actually be populated by real works of art. But it's also important to note that the exhibition always, right from the beginning, was to have a social component and have an online component. So while this has been a rather stressful transition and less celebratory in some ways because we haven't been able to be physically together and to see these wonderful things. It hasn't always been centered on things, but on relations. And Faye and Rudi will be talking primarily about that aspect. At the very beginning, in being tasked with this project, I wanted to come up with a theme that was to extend on previous iterations, particularly the notion of kinship came to mind. And I was interested in kinship. How can I say this? So, when you're working in the Indigenous arts community, realize everybody is really related. If they're not related by kin, by literal blood, you're related because it's a very small community and you're related because you know the people, because you maybe taught them or were taught by them. There's all these relations. And in the dominant art world, there's prohibitions based on this sort of Kantian notion of aesthetic distance. There's these prohibitions on showing people who you know and love or had these friendships or mentor-mentee relationships with. And when I thought of kinship right away, it was, you know what? I love Margaret Orr's artwork. I've been working with her for 3 years. She's my grad student or was my grad student, or Kevin McKenzie or Judy Anderson. I really want to show them here, but I feel that there's these restrictions in the dominant way. And then I thought if I could open that up, maybe they want to invite people who are their kin, their blood relations or friends. And then I was thinking about other artists who live in the woods, live on reserve, and they have kinships with the land and with territory, with animals that are very different from mine, who I've mostly lived in the city. How do we get those related? Anyways, it started ballooning and ballooning. And so a central tenet right from the beginning was to disturb this dominant curatorial practice, and maybe this is a form of indigenizing it. So we invited about 20 artists and asked them to invite more artists of their kin, and many of them came forward with those. And it was a way of sort of undoing that authorial tendency within the curators, where it's an academic enterprise or an intellectual enterprise surrounded by one mind. And so when I invited Faye Mullen, I suggested, do you want to work alone or do you want to work with somebody else? What's your capacity? What are your strengths and interests? I'm living in Regina. We really needed folks who were on the ground in Montreal. And I met Faye through another kin, Nadia Muir. And there are these interesting connections. We're all quite different. We're living apart. And yet there's all these ways that we're working similarly. And both Faye and then Faye brought in Rudi, created these extensions to ideas and possibilities that one individual wouldn't be able to do properly or take kind of authority or authorship of. So those are the main things I want to talk about, just to sort of introduce the sort of different way that we're producing things. So not just directed to objects, but relations, and not the individual curatorial genius, but sort of spread it out. And so now I'd like to turn it over to Rudi and Faye to talk about their engagement in the community. Faye, Rudi, who would like to go first?
Great.
Yeah, I can go first. That's fine. Okay. Gwe Nidali was Rudi, Wilistagueana, Gujeo, Sagamawi, Maliguk, Sedensis. Hi, my name is Rudi. I'm Wilistague from Fredericton, New Brunswick, that of which is unceded Wilistague territory. I'm coming here today. I'm currently based on Tiohtià:ke, Mouniang, Montreal, where I'm an uninvited guest. These lands have been in the care of Indigenous nations from time immemorial, and these relations are currently held with the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. I recognize myself as a guest here because I think it's really important to recognize the ways in which I benefit from being on this land and participating within these structures that have disenfranchised Indigenous people from their sovereign territories. Here on Tiohtià:ke, I work, I study, and I live away from my own homelands, and I aim to do that as humbly and respectfully as possible. And then just a little bit more about me. I'm first and foremost an auntie, committed to my responsibility to care for my kin and those who I'm in relation with. I'm an artist, an organizer, and curator, among other titles. But for the 2020 edition of BACA, I've been acting as assistant curator to David in the overall curation of the biennial, and more specifically working closely with Faye to co-curate a series of public programs featuring performances, roundtables, and other gatherings in the spirit of the overarching theme of kinship.
Faye?
Kwe, Gichizaigan and Wabishkiku Gichigami, dish with one spoon. Anishinaabe, Algonquin, Omariniwag, Indabegagos, Jaganash, Italian, Irish, Chukchage, Mouniang, Indabesho, Kinship, Yetnikurene, Oshkabewes, Medewin, Nizi Ojijak, they, them, she, her, Gawin, Mashi, Nigingo, Nidodem, Faye Mullen, Indigenous. So just recognizing that today we're gathering, I'm actually currently on the lands in which I was born and raised in relation with, but recognizing that I'm far from what I've come to know as home due to the welcoming nature of the Kanien'kehá:ka and particularly the Two-Spirit youth that I work closely with in relation. But recognizing that today we're gathering in a network that is vast and wide, spread over web kinship ties, and that we're recognizing that I'm coming to mind a text by Leanne Bedemasaki Simpson, who says that there's no land on the internet, there are no bodies on the internet, and calling the lands and waters in which we're all in relation to across this vast web. So through these internet connections, recognizing and acknowledging the lands and waters that cross our relationalities and gather us here today. In community, I am a support worker to Indigenous youth. I'm an artist, a maker, performance work mostly. Always curious about materiality and sculptural form, and how that is connected to the way I sense through the world. With BACA, alongside with Rudi and David, I'm grateful to collaborate with the BACA Curatorial Visionings for 2020. And I sought guidance and conversation and ceremony with faith keepers, Otsitsekenra and Yarin of the Longhouse in Kahnawake, for my role in kind of awakening a spirit to that role. And they gifted me with the community name of Yetnikurene, which is a pathfinder who continuously mines the thinking and carries the teachings of the wolf So in that, I stepped into this role with BACA to mind the thinking and provide relationalities with and through and continuously sensing through those connectivities with community and how our engagements can cross-pollinate one another.
Wow,
Grateful to be here.
That's beautiful. You know, I had a few things in mind that I want to talk about, especially digging into the exhibition. But now that I have the chance of you two here, I think I'd like to talk a little bit about methodologies and some of the guiding principles of your general practices and how that might manifest itself in the BACA curatorial process. And so the panel title is about weaving wisdom. And I can't remember who came up with that. It could have been collectively, but weaving and beading have always been central to my thinking in terms of methodology, because it's this idea of strands always being in relationship and tight relationships. And there's also a sense of time and continuity, but also utility. And in this exhibition, probably half the works are beaded or textiles, could be worn on the body, and you have a sense of them being maybe arrested as outfits or costumes, but they could have a life beyond just being a display object. I thought that was quite important. And I also have to say, Faye and Rudi, when we first met, often when I'm working with institutions as a curator, it's like pulling teeth trying to explain some of these concepts and why, if we're going to do something, it's leaving something else out, or how do we expand that, all these implications. And I wonder if you could talk about, from your points of view as young and rising scholars, artists, the importance of these sort of informing concepts to your practice.
I think in this context especially, I think it's really critical to kind of acknowledge the coming together that Faye and I had, in terms of Faye inviting me to come speak with her. And I brought jam, which is a way of expressing my own sort of care, is like this thing that I made that is so important to me. And it was so cold that day. I think it was like in the middle of December, and I brought you this jam because it felt like something that I needed to bring to you. And I think at that point we were very aware of one another, and sort of I was very aware of the things that you were working on, and I know we kind of had that moment of like, oh, this feels like a thing that was sort of destined to happen at some point. And I think sort of relishing in that, there's like romance to the way that kinships come together, and they feel so full of care and love just from like the jump. And I think that just like that moment in which we connected in that way, I was like, okay, we're going to be able to build something build something really exciting, and build something really consciously, because I think just from the like hour or so that I spent in your studio, us speaking together, that was made very clear to me that we were coming to this with different backgrounds, different strengths, different interests, but they all sort of came together around care. And how we show and express love for one another, especially as people who were relatively on like the fringes of one another's lives, but we're connected through mutual friends and mutual kin, and that kind of, I think that was very much a weaving together of our own relationalities and, you know, our journeys, and as young people in these kinds of institutions and these kinds of structures of, yeah.
I just finished that jam recently. It's in full circle. And just in time for those berries to come up. And hoping to, after the harvest, maybe we can make some jam together and continue that relationship. But too, the wider cast of like how our relationality, we're always on the fringes of one another, and that there were lots of mutual ties and relationalities. I feel to say that it relates to our curatorial vision too for BACA, is this, what is this idea of kinship? And if we're understanding it as a kind of web where there's different points of nodes where threads intersect, that one node, if there's, you know, emotion or processing happening within that one node, it is bound to the other nodes are bound to respond. So it's like really about this response-based connection through kinship ties, where you're not always aware of everyone within your cast of relationalities. And by everyone, I'm not just talking about human relatives. I'm talking about, you know, our other relatives, our other non-human relatives, our two-legged ones, winged ones, and insects, and all of those in between, our plant medicine. So how we're connected in those ways. And when we're in relationality with each other, how does that then transcend and continue through this kind of resonant connection with other folks we're in kinship with? It's interesting to be able to envision exhibitions or, you know, an opportunity or an event within the art world that responds to the ways in which we sense through the world and the ways in which we want to be in relation. Although bound by, you know, a capitalist venture, also the art world really often limits us, and to kind of expand that and widen that and allow for breath within that is really important. A fox just ran by.
No.
Honestly. I honestly have never seen that in my life. So
wow.
You're on these lands.
This morning.
The panel has ended. Wow.
Thank you for that, Big Wish. I'm so surprised.
I have to ask you too, because I'm quite astounded at your confidence. So I'm 57 years old. I don't know how to explain my relation to the art world. Certainly as someone who enjoys it, the first half of my career was spent more, I would say, as a critic, as a critical person. And it gets very tiresome and wearing. And yet what the two of you seem to have done, I don't know if this is through education, through community, or how this happened, but you seem to have access not only to knowledge, but to elders, and a confidence that allows you to center relationality, center things beyond capital, all these things, almost like you have it in as a whole, you know, it gives you confidence. And I'm wondering, is that contingent on these relations with elders and constantly going back, coming forward? Is it because you find a utility, a usefulness that goes beyond the dominant norms within the art world? Or what is it that has allowed you to be confident and strong and make these good decisions and good works?
Thank you, first of all. I don't think that's something that I think, like me, like a lot of other younger people, and not even just younger, like generations in these kinds of spaces, have like such an intense sense of imposter syndrome. Like, oh, I just managed to get here to do this kind of work by some sort of unseen force, or I was in the right place at the right time. And so I really appreciate that it comes across as if I am confident. And I think the thing that I am confident in is my relations. I think like being in the academy, being within an academic institution has been really trying for me in a lot of times. But I think what really is at the core of everything is knowing that I first have the privilege to leave my home community and am supported in so many different ways by so many different people. But I think at the very center of everything that I do is knowing that taking that privilege is something to acknowledge, but also to work towards, and sort of doing everything in a good way for the people who have supported me in being able to access the things I can, being able to do the things that I do, and thinking of those who I'm in relation with who have not had that privilege. So moving forward and taking what I can in stride, and knowing that it's not me doing the work, it's me in conversation with a lot of people who are supporting me, and me sort of having the access to carry the work out.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so grounding and inspiring to hear those words. And they're definitely resonant in the way that I would never name it as confidence, and grateful that it comes across as that also. Though I feel to say that it's a real pleasure, and I'm really grateful to have community to be accountable to and with, and that brings you into a role that is often beyond like your meat sack and beyond your own mental capacity, that you really step into the role that you're called to. And that definitely drastically shifted when Utitsikhenran gifted me the title of Yetnekurene for BACA. A lot of things I definitely started to witness and sense that my relationalities to those lands, in particular of Chuchagemunyang, that opened up a lot, and you start to recognize the synchronicities and the patternings all around you. And yeah, not to mention that it really feels ancestor and helper led, working particularly with someone that's also open to that, and moving through different temporalities that we're used to in academia, which has also been very trying. I mean, I've been in academia a long time, but not to say that it hasn't all the while given me access to voices within me, but also denied me of or invisibilized parts of myself that definitely community has reawakened again and again. And I'm beyond moved by that, how grounded practices can feed our life work.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Just speaking to that super briefly, but I think within the academy, and maybe where that sense of confidence comes from, is knowing that I've been able to intellectualize my identity through the academy. So I know that I have the language that's necessary in order to self-actualize myself to certain audiences, mm-hmm. in a way that has both, I think, disconnected me from some community, but allowed me to see sort of the access points necessary to sort of bend and manipulate in order to make that a larger conversation about how we see ourselves, how are we writing about ourselves, how are we explaining ourselves to others and one another. I think that has kind of like brought that all together for me too. There's such a language involved that feels critical.
Yeah. And the question you put forward, David, was about beading and weaving, and I see very much so that language is material that we can bead and weave and move in ways that brings us, life affirming work. Mm-hmm. And we've seen, to be able to be here and share through these words it's not because of all the writers and thinkers that have put things into words, into the English word, English language that is so bound. Calling in those thinkers and writers that give us language for this.
I think it's important. I'm always impressed at how our figurative language, our metaphors, when we indigenize them, actually change in English how we think about things. Mm-hmm. And it's not out of accord with, you know, third wave, fourth wave feminism, ecological thinking. There's a wisdom that's not separate and indigenous and not with the world. And I guess that I've been brought up short. Oftentimes in the theoretical space of the university, there can be a kind of a ghettoizing of indigenous thought rather than seeing how it reflects everything.
Mm-hmm.
But the moment you get into community and you're talking with elders, they remind you
Mm-hmm.
not to exclude anybody and not to get on a high horse, right? And I wanted to come back, you know, you mentioned our wonderful early connection with Ganawage and being welcomed there. That was a shock to me, you know, like I'm used to being in, you know, with elders and in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and I'm pretty comfortable with Cree and Blackfoot folks, but you know, Mohawks and that, they've got a reputation. But they were so welcoming, and that I love the unfolding too, how we were sort of, there were sort of two rows, the sort of BACA row and them, and then we were sort of, not till the very end, we were saying, well, you know, I'm Métis, this person, and, you know, pretty much we were all Indigenous. And they were just so even, sort of that double layer of welcoming. And then that we were able to go back for ceremony later with the ashes was quite moving, you know, but it also felt that kind of privilege came with a responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's something that has been very trying with the COVID, you know, that we can't be there, and we can honor the relations as best we can, but that physical, tactile part of being a guest, a welcome guest in that case, on territory not our own or not our ancestors. I'm really feeling that lack and breach at the moment. I don't know how you two have been contending with that, but that seems quite difficult and unfortunate.
Mm-hmm.
There's a few different sides to that. I think Faye and I've been turning that over for a while in terms of looking at what we had planned for our public programming and how that's had to shift now into this virtual space. I think in a generous way, it allows us to reach so many more people. And Faye and I were just speaking this morning about, you know, kin that we have who are immunocompromised, who are, you know, not as able-bodied as I am. You know, there are different ways that this allows so many different access points by hosting things online, but I think it is kind of a very Indigenous way to like want to be there. You know, we want to like be in Sweat. We want to be at the powwow. There's this way that our kinship is so tactile. But I think often of like my experience, I consider myself sort of like part of a part-time diaspora where I spend so much time here in Jojage, but this is not my homeland. My ancestors did not have relations to this territory. And so thinking of how so many of my experiences with my kin and what I've considered such a formative part of my life, like my nation kin, have been through the internet, have been through things like Instagram and Facebook and FaceTime. And so I think I think while these things have definitely had to shift and we're sort of longing for that touch, I think it does open up a different world that we're not inherently used to catering to or making more accessible.
Would you mind, we've been talking very abstractly and about our practices, but I think in a way it's important for people to see behind the scenes. But can you describe how that makes its way into action, talking about planting and circles and what you've got planned on the outreach and performative side?
In a lot of ways, our collective care has to look quite differently when it comes to the COVID reality that we're facing, and not to rush getting back into a physical space with one another, and so to be able to, you know, center and also just acknowledge those in our community that are immunocompromised, which are so many of our closest kin. to be mindful of our pacing when it comes to coming back together has been something that I think through this COVID reality we've been considering on the back end of programming and building that programming that can reach a wider, more vast network of relations through the web, which isn't accessible to everyone, but Zoom at least allows us to have also a call-in phone number that's not long distance. So that's at least, another layer of how the internet or this modality can give us, a wider cast. In our programming, it's been very much so built from a response-based perspective, and I'm not sure if you feel the same way, Rudi, but it's in relation to the artists and getting feedback about what they want to, how they want to contribute to a wider programming, and also response-based not only to the artists but community, definitely centering anything that we've heard or come across or come to know by being in ongoing right relations with the community, particularly folks in Ganawage and Ganstage. What often, coming into supporting what is already being done in community is something that's interesting. And also coming into, bridging that gap between, we know someone that has this knowledge and community members would love access to that. Or thinking particularly about our Two-Spirit and trans and Indigenous queer community members who often get marginalized and cast out of ceremony or doesn't have access to knowledge because of the safety and the language, the kind of infectious binary language that's used often in our communities. So bridging those relations and providing, just pathways. I don't see us, doing like work that is out of this world. We're just making those links happen.
Mm-hmm. And I think in more concrete terms, I think a big part of making those opportunities and that knowledge accessible has kind of come to be offering different types of workshops where people who do have these knowledges are able to share it. We're engaging a medicine walk over Zoom, which is something that I know that I'm really missing access to territory and to the bush. And so witnessing people who have this knowledge to share kind of lead participants and viewers through that, I think is really exciting. So trying to address these physical needs that we have in the best capacities that we can in conversation with artists and facilitators, so that we're not entirely saying, hey, this is what we think needs to happen, let's do it, but more in a way of, we know that we've noticed that this is work that you've been doing and we'd love to engage that in a larger capacity with a larger audience. So not only can that knowledge be transmitted, but their practice is made more visible also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and deeper in community work, when there's deep listening happening, you start to make those connections of, knowing and coming to know for years Hunter Kesnet, who's working with hides and our animal relatives, and then hearing that it's of great interest for people to have access to those knowledges about how to process and how to honor our animal relatives, and knowing that and trusting that Hunter could do that in a safe way, because that's how I've come to know Hunter, is through that work of coming across Amek on a highway, a beaver on a highway, and driving directly to Hunter's place and saying, just knowing that I would be accepted with Amek by my side. And that was all in the making to be able to provide that bridge of link to community and to other communities, particularly Two-Spirit, trans, and indigiqueer community, to be able to access that knowledge, which is so much, so much coded in binary thinking. And to have that knowledge shared by a Two-Spirit community member definitely is affirming.
That's interesting. Both of you mentioned this notion of, I would call it seeing or witnessing and calling up. And often in Indigenous communities, people don't step forward, they prefer to be asked, recognized, for their skills and knowledge and whatever it is. And what's interested me in this process of having, say, senior artists select their kin is that notice, that it's not, I'm thinking of Glenn Coulthard's Against the Politics of Recognition Within the Dominant, that we're able to do it for ourselves. For me, it was important to sort of pull these shackles off with Kinship. I want to acknowledge, Bob Boyer, who had a big impact on me before he passed, and Sherry Farrell-Rissette, who's a colleague, but has influenced so many people. And that they are, I didn't do all the numbers, but I think we have 6 people with PhDs and about, I don't know how many, more than a dozen who are teaching at universities, and a couple of you are doing your PhDs. And yet there's a certain groundedness to this group that isn't looking for acknowledgement outside of the group. It's more like, how do these things speak to each other? How do these people speak to each other? And that's what I was talking about earlier, that sense of loss is, I want to see those dialogues. We're privileged. We have that dialogue, we have connections. I'm hoping that through the online versions, some of this connection is able to occur, even if they're in small circles of mutual acknowledgement. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
I hope we can increase that.
I think so much of what contributes to that, or at least I can imagine a position that I was in, sort of like before I was really engaged in the art world, before I was working in the ways that I'm working now, there is a hesitancy there. And I think a lot of that can be boiled down to a couple things, but I think a lot of it is generational. I think that like Faye and I's generation were a little bit more timid, and I think to see the sort of, I don't necessarily want to call it a discrepancy, but I think there are a lot of folks who exist in between like emerging and more senior artists, where it's kind of just a really strange gray area. And I think while we have connections, I don't want to think of it in a hierarchical up and down way, but more in a linear way, where we have connections who are emerging, we have connections who are more senior. How do we bridge the link between both in a way that's genuine, in a way that is focused on more capacity building and conversation? Because I think of the folks who I know who are emerging, who are interested in this type of work but don't necessarily know how to access it, I think there needs to be that flattening of you can still participate in the conversation if you don't have a PhD. There is still that knowledge that is so valuable to this type of discourse that isn't going to come from the academy. And I think also speaking in terms of the ways in which Faye and I have both spoken about in terms of working relationally, I know how education can affect you on both sides there. And I think everything that I do and that I write and that I'm interested in, it means nothing if I can't explain it to my grandfather.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's like, because I'm younger, and I have more institutionalized education than he does. But if I'm doing this work and it can't be transmitted to the people I care about most, who is it for? What does it mean? And so I think making it very visible that this type of work is very much in the spirit of, in support of community, and knowing that those people who are interested can present themselves and can come forward, I think is very much about opening that.
That's such a good point, because part of my anxiety when we went to Ganawage is that they might not be interested in what we have to offer. You know, and I'm sure to some degree they wouldn't be, But then as we started talking, and then we realized, hey, there's artists here who had never been tapped before for these sites, and they are interested. You know, it's not just about bringing Kahnawake people to these sites of replete with learning and beauty and all that. It's about this reciprocity. And when you mentioned, Faye, about bringing Hunter in, it's not because we want to put on a big, show. It's that there was something that's needed in Kahnawake, and you were able to make that connection. One of the struggles that I had early on, so this is going back 27 years ago, there was a group called the Minquan Panchayat, and it was a gathering in Calgary of First Nations and so-called of color people. And basically they did an inventory and realized that the artist-run centers, Indigenous and of color people, weren't being shown, like not at all. And so it caused a huge sea change when people had to recognize that, that thing that you were saying, reasons that kept people out, it was called racism then. I don't know what we call it now. But also it was something else too. And I wrote an essay at that time that was about looking for equality, it was called, but E was in brackets, and it was a notion of quality. One of the big barriers is that not only the dominant culture people, but also the disenfranchised had a question about quality. Is their work going to measure up? Does this fit in? And what I've realized over the decades is that term quality is usually, a dominant discourse, not a real measure. And when you put things in relations, like, when we've got an artist, they're not comparing PhDs and papers, they're comparing peyote stitches, are those beads tight? And that the person can enter into a bead discourse and measure up, right? There's still evaluations. I'm not a non-hierarchical person. I know that there are people with more knowledge than me, and so they have an ontological, there's something that I need to learn from them. But it's not structured, my sense of ontology isn't structured by university knowledge. It's useful knowledge. And like you say, Neil MacLeod called it the Kokum test. If the grandparents aren't going to understand it, then it's not knowledge. It might be information that has currency only in one place, but real knowledge is transferable. And when you go to elders and they're telling you they have real knowledge, they mean for everybody. There's special Blackfoot knowledge that's just for Blackfoot and for men or for women, but these larger knowledges are the things that I think are coming through this artwork. And I don't know, I'm starting to get excited. Like, I get really excited about this exhibition. I wish people will go online and make those connections that I see. I just want to bring, because we haven't been talking too much about particular works, I mentioned Margaret Orr earlier, and she's a Cree from Northern Quebec, but was doing her MFA in the University of Regina. And when she first got there, she was thinking, okay, I want to do something about the territory that I'm at right now. And she started doing some work on the prairies, and it's not home. And then she realized there's this thing since 1984 that's been bothering her. And this is where Hydro-Quebec opened up their dams, this newly created hydroelectric project, and 10,000 migrating caribou were destroyed. And it had such an impact on her. And so she created for her master's, she realized she has the luxury and the privilege of this 2 years to work on something. Why not do something that matters, not only to her, but to her community? So I really, right at the very beginning, I wanted that work there because Stuart Hall Gallery is right on the river. And so Montreal is implicated in this because all this hydroelectricity is coming to really southern Quebec and looking at these relations. And it was I was at an anthropology conference in November or October in Vancouver, met this guy named Arndt from Norway, and I had been there in a tour with the Sami people for a short tour, about 10 days, looking at Indigenous sites and knowledge. And anyways, this guy Arndt says, well, you got to know about this artist, this German artist. I'm looking for his name here, I forgot all of a sudden, Rainier Whittenborn, who had been doing a site-specific social project with her people when she was just finishing high school about the dam. Anyways, I'm so happy to bring these people together. But while I was in Sami territory, I met up with Margaret Orr, whose brother, they're from a reindeer family. And right now, currently, this isn't in the past, her brother had to destroy, I think it was 200 of his reindeer because the state is unhappy that the reindeers go across the territories. Sami territory is in Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia, and they move their herds across. And so they want them to control and cull their herds, so they just keep them in their country rather than their territory. Anyways, it's kind of a complex story, but I was so taken because she did this installation where she had a photo of this tower of reindeer skull or heads that her brother had to take from the culled herd, and she piled them outside of the courthouse where his brother was going on trial for resisting this order. And then she paired it with a photo of the bison bones at Oskana. This is a pile of bones that I live. And this Indigenous thing is an international thing. And it's not only in the past, but right now in the present. And I think that that's an important part of this exhibition, and that your curatorial project as to talking about these things that are not part of the fluff and feathers aspect of Indigenous is something that is unknown often to Indigenous people as well. And you're talking about Indigenous people particularly. And I wondered if you would amplify the necessity of inclusion and visibility, and also how we're reorientating ourselves to be inclusive, but not, creating a ghetto. Do you know what I mean? Does this make sense?
Yeah, sort of how to address it without considering it as like the monolith of queerness or queer indigeneity, and that these intersections are made visible but not flattened.
Yeah, I don't know how to articulate. I'm going to ramble for a second here. I'm working on it. I was working with Carmen Papalia the summer before, last summer, on disabilities. He's a non-visual learner or non-visual artist, he calls himself. And when I was thinking of, when we were there, we had this profound meeting. It was a gathering of people, and realized that what the institution was trying to do is lump people, queer folks, or in those cases, blind people, and then we're going to accommodate your group rather than negotiate space as an individual. And I'm wondering if curation or even circles, does it lump, or does it allow for these individual nuances, which sort of undoes the institution? That's what I've been thinking. Does that happen in your circles?
I think for me it does. I think especially situating myself as somebody who's from the East Coast, peoples with a longer history of colonization, a lot of the knowledges we have aren't inherently ours, but sort of like came out of that re-indigenization, like post-potlatch era. And I think specifically our ideas around queerness are very colonized. I think that it's just been very recently that people are starting to incorporate terms like two-spirit, which we know is not, came from the 90s, but is very unspecific. And so I think sort of this teasing out of queerness within like an Indigenous context has been happening a lot, especially I think from people of our generation in the last 5-10 years, about how we imagine ourselves as queer people who are also Indigenous. And so I think while there was like and this is all very much speculative, but I think there was a time when a lot of queer Indigenous folks were latching on to terms like two-spirit. I think that has kind of exploded in a way where people are now starting to search more to articulate exactly what queerness is from their nation, from their ancestors, from their communities. And I think I'm seeing that present itself a lot more in communities that I'm a part of, where folks who identify under like queer as an umbrella term aren't necessarily identifying themselves as two-spirit. And so I think that's where that distinction is so important, where it's queer Indigenous folks, indigiqueer, two-spirit. There are different intersections in which those are made possible, by being made visible.
How does that embodied experience affect curatorial practice or scholarly practice, since you're both students as well?
Yeah, I think to be mindful that the silos and the labeling is a part of the colonial, settler colonial project in relation to capitalism. And those silos are categories that we often find ourselves within or stepping into in hopes to find community. Like I do think stepping into those identities is important for our, like, coming to know of oneself and coming to know those who we want to surround ourselves with. But after that work is done, there's also an acknowledgement that those silos can also be used to control and censor and cast judgment even more so, and create pockets within our community that don't necessarily have those, that weaving that we so love and is so nourishing to us, particularly with intergenerational relations, right? So yeah, breaking down those barriers, breaking down those categories is important for to be able to make world with kin, and to be able to envision futures as well as pasts that are continuously being remade and rethought through. Well, to reclaim that, not necessarily rethought through, but sensed through and resensed. I feel to not necessarily prioritize the thinking and the language and the voicing.
And I think maybe why that's been made so prevalent among our generation, we're very much embodying notions of our own queerness in terms of our work and our practices. I think that we have that license in ways that our kin and our ancestors didn't. You know, I think that we are at a very particular time where you know, our aunties, our uncles, our ancestors were being policed for being Indigenous.
Yeah.
So by being queer in these different times, they were also being policed for being queer. And I think that we have a lot more opportunity at this moment to say, hey, you know, we're queer and Indigenous, and those are both informing one another and are also mutually exclusive. I think there's a lot more space to explore what those relationships mean, while also honoring how queerness has presented itself for millennia within our communities, you know. And even now with people who may not want to name themselves as queer, but like thinking of like the aunties with all the lovers, and like there are so many ways that these things are expressed that aren't so specifically articulated in the way that maybe we're articulating them now.
This is going off on a side tangent, but I have to say I'm so taken by the way you're talking, because my experience of I've always looked for the site of the Indigenous, you know, that pure site. You know, you go to this elder, you go to that elder. And I've watched them change over time. So I find a lot of elders are still heavily Christianized for the most part, not always, but when the dialogue around, I have and I have permission from B to mention them now and then, but my eldest kid is Two-Spirit, and they're really comfortable with that phrasing because that's them. They literally are neither one nor the other nor both. You know what I mean? It's and I studied this theory when I went to university in my master's, but that was on paper. But the wisdom of watching them unfold and learn to be themselves and to take greater time, not to rush, has been sort of overwhelming to me. But the queer dialogue, especially using language, older terms to remind people, elders or knowledge keepers, I prefer to say in this case, knowledge keepers of something before the Christian indoctrination, that wisdom. And I've watched them change over time. So it's not just elders telling us what's what, but there's been more of a dialogue happening. And I think art is one of those things that creates this dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
Was again at Banff Center for another occasion, and Sykes Powderface, who I don't know, he must be close to 90 now. We had this humbling moment of doing this miniature parfleche bag together. And because his hands had difficulty with hole punches or something, we were working together. And there was something so humbling about that activity, that hands-on activity together. And I'm finding this special case for art, you know, that is beyond the conversation or includes conversation. It's certainly beyond the academy. I think of Sherry Fell-Rissette and Kathy Mattis and other scholars with, you know, their PhDs at a conference beating while they're presenting. I think there's a queering of the art world, an indigenization of curatorial practices that they're not separable. They seem to be very much hand in glove. And I just found that when we started this thing, it was very easy. I have to say, I didn't come to this with confidence. I came to it with a lot of anxiety. But I see confidence in that your generation, or the two of you as persons, have been able to bring these things together. And I wonder, just as we're wrapping things up, is there a place towards where this might go? So I've talked in the past about sovereign indigenous display territories, or the idea of irreconcilable spaces of indigeneity. The notion, again, like Glenn Coulthard, that it's not signifying in the dominant culture that is the goal. Mm-hmm. There are some relations that are important, just as various First Nations, Métis nations have to be in dialogue with the state. That's not where we understand ourselves. That's not the relationship that defines us. Do you see any of these ideas towards where you think we ought to go as curators and artists, or what do you see as the future?
I think so often, and like so much about the future, that it ends up being this kind of like muddle or like puddle of just, I don't know. But I think what feels like future making or like future practice to me is conversations like these ones, where, David, I've looked throughout my entire academic career, I've thought alongside you for so often, and you know, Irreconcilable Spaces of Aboriginality has been a text that I've come back to again and again in so many different contexts and so many different projects. And I think opening up spaces like these ones, where we are bridging that generational gap, we're bridging different educational gaps, access gaps. You know, there's so much that's being kind of collapsed here by opening up these conversations that we're having, that feels like we're making future. Mm-hmm. You know, those things are not being passed down as much as they're being passed between one another, and those different knowledges, those different access points are being woven into one another, so that we can sort of present these kinds of thoughts, present these kinds of visions into a suggestion for future.
Beautiful. I like that. I just want to say, you know, on a practical note, BACA began really within Art Muir, and you mentioned, you know, capitalism and commercial space. And I have to say, you know, they've really opened up. I don't impugn too many intentions to people, but I was worried, where are we going to meet friction? And the friction usually comes with budget, you know, very practical things. But quite a few of the works in the show, more than half, are not for sale. Mm-hmm. You know, people want to hold them because they're relations, and some people actually said that, you know. Mm-hmm. And then other pieces are borrowed from the collection, from collections, because they are historical things that needed to be there. I'm curious as to how these relations will go, you know, because there was far less friction here in my experience than working with a museum that has, you know, the air has to be a certain way. You can't bring a cedar branch in. And I'm curious whether we can indigenize these sites. And, you know, and we did, because in this case, we implied a relationship with Kahwatsiretátie that's got to go past our tenure in this project. And maybe we can work within institutions in this occupation way. I'm not sure how to describe it. But there is that root of curation as being care. I don't think we're being disingenuous. We're trying to establish cycles and circuits of care. Yeah, anyways, sorry. I'm just very excited about all these connections. And I just hope that the public who's hearing this will see these objects and see these interconnections or participate in the online projects. Faye, can I pass it to you, because you're the PhD student, and you'll be writing the book, and I'm curious as what you see the future, and you find a trajectory is being set here that has a future.
I definitely see our movements in every step, or in every intention that we set, work that's envisioning futures. And I definitely use an S with future and past. And I would lean more into my teachings from my Medeowin healer rather than my PhD, to talk about folding time and how often I'm reminded that I would love to exist and see kin existing within that fold, within the action of folding time, and continuously braiding that possibility. I see that by the way of having 3 curators equally voiced along with this work, really created something that will hopefully bridge into new possibilities and continue a path of making for BACA into the future. And hopefully it will be better every 2 years.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, why don't we leave it there? It's been an honor working with you too, and I appreciate so much your Fox relative.
Yeah.
That is, it's such a wonderful thing when that happens. It sort of disrupts a certain kind of thing and opens up something else.
Yeah.
But thank you very much for your hard work. It's gone above and beyond in these difficult times, and I appreciate that your ethics and need for care haven't caused you to have a breakdown yet.
Grateful for the trust that we've been able to build along the way within our collective, but also with community members.
All right. Well, thank you very much.